The 16th of December 1944, Ardennes, Belgium. The night was bitterly cold, the snow falling in thick curtains, muffling the sounds of distant artillery. The unexpected German assault hit hard and fast, a desperate push aimed at splitting the Allied lines. Under the orders of Adolf Hitler, the Germans struck at the heart of the Allied defenses, aiming to divide the American and British forces and reclaim the initiative in the war. The attack was a brutal surprise, exploiting a gap in the American lines that had been overlooked in the chaos of winter preparations. The 5th Panzer Army, spearheaded by the formidable Tiger II tanks and supported by the 6th SS Panzer Army, pressed forward into the Ardennes forest. The ground was frozen, the roads treacherous, but the Germans pushed ahead, relying on the sheer power of their assault. At first, it seemed as if the Allies were caught off guard. The American forces, spread thin across the front, scrambled to form a cohesive defense. Bastogne, a key crossroads in the Ardennes, fell into German hands within days. The American 101st Airborne Division, surrounded and isolated, fought fiercely to hold their ground. The sight of the German tanks advancing through the dense forest was a grim reminder of the German determination. Yet, in the chaos of battle, something unexpected happened. The Germans, despite their overwhelming firepower, were slowed by their own logistical failings, running low on fuel and supplies. As the battle raged, the silence of the forest only deepened the tension. The roar of artillery and the clatter of tank treads were swallowed by the snow, creating an eerie stillness. The Germans had made their move, but the outcome of their surprise assault was far from certain. In the cold, dark hours of the night, both sides waited for the next move. The battle for Bastogne had just begun, but the fate of the Ardennes campaign was already hanging by a thread. The Battle of the Bulge was not just another skirmish, it was the last desperate gamble by Adolf Hitler to turn the tide of the war in the West. On the 16th of December 1944, the German military launched a massive offensive in the Ardennes, a region largely seen as a quiet, vulnerable stretch of the Western Front. The stakes were nothing short of survival for the Nazis. Hitler believed that a powerful breakthrough in this area would divide the Allied forces, force a negotiation, and allow the German war machine to regroup. For the Germans, this attack was a final attempt to buy time, to salvage their faltering hold on the Western Front. The Allies had been making steady progress, pushing through France, and their sights were set firmly on Germany itself. The German High Command knew that without a decisive victory, they would lose the initiative for good. Hitler's plan was both audacious and reckless. He insisted that all available resources be thrown into a single, overwhelming blow. His leadership was rooted in impulse, demanding quick results without regard for the logistical strains that would follow. The plan was based on one core assumption, that the Allies were unprepared for such a massive assault, particularly in the harsh winter conditions. The Germans began their attack with heavy armor. The formidable Tiger II tanks, known for their immense firepower, were central to the assault. These tanks, along with the Panther and a large infantry force, tore through the Ardennes forest, exploiting the gaps in the American defenses. The initial success of the Germans, marked by the quick capture of towns like Streetvith and Bastogne, seemed to confirm the effectiveness of their strategy. The American forces, caught off guard, struggled to respond. The 101st Airborne Division, surrounded and isolated in Bastogne, became the symbol of the American resistance. Their defense was a desperate fight to hold key terrain while waiting for reinforcements. Yet, even as the Germans gained ground, the cracks in their strategy began to show. Their supply lines stretched thin, and the weather, which had initially helped shield the German forces from Allied air superiority, soon became their enemy. The same snow that had slowed the Allies' mobility now hampered the Germans, with their tanks and trucks bogged down in the freezing mud and snow. They were advancing fast, but their fuel and ammunition supplies were dwindling. The Wehrmacht was stretching itself too thin, attempting to outpace its logistical support. In contrast, Eisenhower's patience and careful planning began to show its value. The American commander-in-chief had long emphasized the importance of preparation and coordination among the Allied forces. Despite the initial shock of the German attack, Eisenhower kept his cool, relying on his extensive network of commanders to implement a rapid but coordinated response. While the Germans fought for a breakthrough, the Americans held firm, waiting for their reserves to be mobilized and for the weather to turn in their favor. The Third Army, under General Patton, was a crucial element of the American counteroffensive. Patton's forces, poised to act in the south, quickly pivoted toward Bastogne, breaking through the encircling German forces and relieving the 101st Airborne. The Germans, despite their tactical superiority in the early stages, had failed to anticipate the resilience of the American forces and the logistical challenges of their own operation. Eisenhower's calm, methodical approach was working, while Hitler's impatient, overly aggressive tactics were beginning to unravel. While the Germans initially saw success, it was a victory without sustainability. The lack of coordination and reliance on Hitler's direct orders left little room for tactical flexibility, and the logistical limitations of the German forces soon became apparent. By the time reinforcements arrived to bolster the American defenses, the Germans had overextended themselves, unable to capitalize on their early successes. The battle that was meant to shatter the Allied forces instead marked the beginning of the end for the German war effort in the West. The Battle of the Bulge, therefore, was not just a fight of tanks and soldiers, it was a clash of command philosophies. Hitler's impulsive and rigid style clashed with Eisenhower's patient, collaborative approach. While the Germans sought rapid, decisive actions, the Americans, under Eisenhower's leadership, held steady, adapting to the changing conditions and maintaining their strategic focus. In the end, it was Eisenhower's discipline and foresight that proved to be the decisive factor in holding the line, while Hitler's impulsiveness only hastened the collapse of Germany's last great offensive in the West. The German forces relied heavily on their formidable tanks, most notably the Tiger II and Panther. These machines were designed to dominate the battlefield with their thick armor and powerful 88mm guns, which could destroy almost any Allied tank from a distance. However, while the Tiger II's firepower was unmatched, its mobility in the rough Ardennes terrain proved to be a significant drawback. The roads were icy, and the mud from the melted snow bogged down the tanks, leaving them vulnerable to ambushes and making it nearly impossible to maintain their rapid advance. The Panther, more mobile than the Tiger, had its own set of problems. Its mechanical failures were common, with the engine often malfunctioning in the cold, and the transmission and other vital components suffering from the demands of the difficult terrain. The German forces also faced severe logistical issues, running low on fuel and ammunition as they pushed deeper into the Ardennes. This lack of essential supplies meant that while they could initially strike with overwhelming force, their offensive would quickly lose steam without the support necessary to sustain it. On the other hand, the American forces, though initially caught off guard, were able to quickly regroup and adapt. The Sherman M4A3, while not as powerful as the German tanks, proved to be an incredibly effective weapon due to its production numbers and versatility. The Sherman could be produced in large quantities and, crucially, could be easily repaired on the battlefield. Its design, although relatively light in armor and armament compared to the Tiger II, made it highly mobile in the rugged Ardennes environment. The Sherman's speed and maneuverability allowed American crews to take advantage of tactical opportunities that the Germans, with their slower and more cumbersome tanks, could not. The Sherman Firefly, armed with a powerful 17-pounder gun, was a crucial asset in countering the German armor. While the standard Sherman struggled against the Tiger II, the Firefly's more potent armament could engage and destroy German tanks with greater efficiency. Despite being slower than the German tanks, the Firefly's firepower ensured that the Allies could effectively challenge the superior German armor, particularly when used in ambushes or combined with infantry tactics. The M4 Pershing, though deployed later in the campaign, was another critical element in the American response. Armed with a 90mm gun, it could penetrate the armor of the Tiger II and Panther more reliably than the standard Sherman. While it had fewer numbers and was not as widely used, the presence of the Pershing boosted morale and gave the Americans a weapon capable of matching the Germans' heaviest tanks. In terms of air support, the Americans held a decisive edge. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its rugged design and powerful armament, played a crucial role in supporting ground operations. Equipped with rockets and machine guns, it was capable of interdicting German supply lines and providing close air support for American infantry and armor. In addition, the P-51 Mustang ensured that the Luftwaffe, which had once been a serious threat to Allied air superiority, was now largely grounded. The Mustang's long range and firepower allowed it to provide continuous cover for American bombers and ground forces, neutralizing German fighter planes and preventing the Luftwaffe from gaining air superiority. With the skies cleared of German fighters, the Allies had a significant advantage in both reconnaissance and air-ground coordination, which directly impacted the battle on the ground. The combination of these elements, American tactical flexibility, effective air support, and the Sherman Firefly's firepower helped turn the tide in key engagements. In the dense forests of the Ardennes, the slower, less mobile German tanks struggled to engage effectively against the fast-moving American forces. The Americans, using their superior communication systems and coordination between air and ground forces, were able to outmaneuver the Germans, forcing them into defensive positions and preventing them from exploiting their initial successes. This adaptability was a result of meticulous planning by Allied commanders and the ability to quickly adjust to the unfolding battle, while German command, under Hitler's direct influence, remained fixed on executing a strategy without considering the changing battlefield realities. The German logistical issues also played a crucial role in their failure to sustain their momentum. As their tanks and vehicles ran out of fuel, they were left stranded in the snow, easy targets for Allied artillery and airstrikes. The Germans had underestimated the strain that such a long, high-intensity assault would place on their already overextended supply lines. Meanwhile, the Allies were able to call on endless reserves and a well-oiled logistical machine, which allowed them to continuously replace losses and maintain pressure on the German forces. At the same time, American forces demonstrated remarkable resilience. In Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division had been surrounded by the German forces, the defenders held out against overwhelming odds. Despite being cut off from reinforcements, the 101st Airborne used their knowledge of the terrain and defensive positions to hold their ground, inflicting heavy casualties on the Germans. When General Patton's Third Army finally broke through the German encirclement, it was clear that the Germans had overextended themselves, unable to maintain a successful offensive despite their initial breakthroughs. While the German tanks were formidable, their inability to sustain their attack in the face of logistical and mechanical challenges highlighted the difference between aggressive, impulsive leadership and the patient, methodical approach of the Allies. Eisenhower's careful planning and coordination ensured that the Americans were always ready to respond to German threats. In contrast, Hitler's impulsive orders to keep advancing, no matter the cost, led to a rapid depletion of resources and morale among his forces, leaving them vulnerable to counterattacks. The Germans were playing for a decisive, quick victory, but their failure to plan for the long-term consequences of their actions ultimately doomed their offensive. The German soldiers in the Ardennes were thrust into a situation they hadn't fully prepared for. Despite the might of their heavy tanks and the superiority of their artillery, they were operating under orders that were both ambitious and reckless. For many, the initial thrill of the attack was quickly replaced with doubt. The Tiger II tanks, though feared across the battlefield, quickly proved to be a burden in the dense, snow-covered forests. The weight and immobility of the tanks were a significant disadvantage in the harsh winter conditions. As they trudged forward, many German soldiers began to realize that the well-oiled war machine they had been taught to believe in was not invincible after all. The Germans had expected to break through with overwhelming force, but logistical problems soon became glaring. Fuel was running low, the bitter cold drained the energy of men and machines alike, and many tanks and vehicles became stuck in the muck or immobilized by mechanical failure. Soldiers who once marched with confidence now trudged forward, weighed down not just by their gear, but by the growing realization that their victory was slipping away with every mile. The cold, so often an ally in the past, was now their enemy. Lack of supplies, combined with the icy conditions, left many soldiers wondering if they would make it through another day. For those manning the Luftwaffe's fighter planes, the battle was no different. The initial excitement of launching a counterattack against the Allied air superiority soon gave way to frustration. The P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts roamed the skies with impunity, protecting the Allied ground forces from above. The Luftwaffe pilots, once formidable in their own right, found themselves facing a foe they couldn't outpace or outgun. The Mustang's escort missions provided relentless protection, and the Luftwaffe pilots soon realized that they were fighting not just the American planes, but the ever-growing technological edge of the Allies. The once feared Luftwaffe had become a shadow of its former self, outclassed and outmaneuvered by more advanced Allied tactics. On the ground, the American soldiers faced a different kind of challenge. Despite being initially caught off guard, the 101st Airborne Division dug in and fought with a calm, resolute determination. Surrounded at Bastogne, they had no choice but to hold their ground. They fought not out of zeal for battle, but out of a sense of duty and survival. As the Germans pressed forward, the Americans had to make quick decisions, adapting to changing circumstances. The weather, which had aided the Germans in the early stages, began to turn in favor of the Americans. Snowstorms, which had initially hindered the Allied air support, now offered the Americans a critical advantage as they prepared for the counteroffensive. The defenders of Bastogne knew they could not win this fight through sheer force alone. They were running low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies, but their resolve was stronger than ever. They could not afford to surrender or retreat. Doing so would mean handing over a key position that the Germans could exploit to split the Allied lines. The relentless pounding of German artillery, the shrieks of incoming shells, and the cold biting at their exposed skin became the backdrop to their struggle. But it was their ability to remain calm under pressure, their commitment to the mission, that kept them standing firm. In the midst of the chaos, the presence of General Patton's Third Army loomed large. Patton, known for his decisive and bold leadership, was the antithesis to the confusion and hesitation of the German command. As the weather cleared, Patton's forces advanced rapidly toward Bastogne. For the German soldiers, Patton's arrival signaled the failure of their initial plan. The momentum they had gained from the early breakthrough began to wane as they faced fresh American reinforcements. The German soldiers, who had initially thought they might overwhelm the American defenses, found themselves in a battle of attrition they could no longer win. For the American troops, Patton's arrival was a moment of reassurance. His unrelenting drive and the sheer power of his forces breathed new life into the American defense. Patton's Third Army, with its rapid mobility and coordinated attacks, broke through the German encirclement at Bastogne, relieving the trapped 101st Airborne Division. It was not a moment of triumph or celebration, it was simply the realization that they had survived, and they were not finished yet. On the German side, however, the mood was grim. The command structure, dominated by Hitler's impulsive decision-making, found itself unable to adjust to the rapidly changing situation. German officers, who had been conditioned to execute orders without question, began to realize that their leadership had overreached. The tanks they had relied on for success were immobilized, their supply lines broken, and their morale shattered. The bitter cold, that had initially been seen as a strategic advantage for the Germans, now acted as a force that turned against them, freezing their equipment and weakening their resolve. The frustration among German soldiers grew as they fought an enemy that did not break under pressure, a force that had already adapted to the realities of warfare in a way the Germans had not. The more the Germans advanced, the clearer it became that their strategy was failing. For the German officers, the failure to secure a decisive victory in the Ardennes meant more than just a tactical setback. It was a blow to their entire strategy on the Western Front. The realization that their last great hope was crumbling under the weight of their logistical failures, internal divisions, and the steadfast American defense set the stage for the eventual collapse of the German offensive. In contrast, the American soldiers, despite their hardship, carried a sense of duty that was grounded in practical, not idealistic terms. They fought not for glory, but for survival, for the defense of the lines that held the Allied forces together. The stakes were high, and they knew that their resilience would be tested in ways they had never imagined. As they faced the Germans in the frigid cold, they understood one thing clearly. Their survival depended on their ability to stay organized, to coordinate under pressure, and to never give in to the chaos surrounding them. For the Germans, the battle was not just about tanks and artillery, it was about the collapse of their command structure and the erosion of their will to fight. The Battle of the Bulge was a turning point for both sides, but it highlighted just how different the two forces were when it came to adaptability and logistics. The American forces, though initially caught off guard, had one major advantage: the ability to adapt quickly. Eisenhower's decision to keep his forces coordinated and flexible in the face of a surprise attack allowed them to respond in ways the Germans could not. As the Germans pushed forward, hoping to catch the Allies unprepared, the Americans quickly reorganized their lines, shifting reinforcements and bringing in fresh supplies from nearby units. The 101st Airborne Division, despite being surrounded in Bastogne, held their positions, demonstrating the resilience of American forces and their capacity to dig in and hold ground under intense pressure. One of the key elements that gave the Americans the upper hand was their logistical superiority. While the German offensive relied heavily on maintaining supply lines that stretched thin, the Americans had a robust and flexible logistical network. This was exemplified by the speed at which supplies and reinforcements were brought to Bastogne, breaking the German siege and allowing American forces to regain the initiative. The Americans had planned for the long haul, knowing that a war of attrition would likely be necessary to defeat the Germans, and they made sure their forces were equipped to endure such a challenge. Their tanks, infantry, and air forces were backed by an extensive network of supply lines and maintenance units that kept them operational, even in the harsh winter conditions of the Ardennes. In contrast, the German forces, despite the initial shock and awe of their assault, struggled with logistical failures almost from the start. Hitler's decision to launch the offensive without securing adequate fuel supplies or ensuring the transport routes could handle the heavy load of equipment proved disastrous. German tank divisions, including the feared Tiger II, found themselves stranded in the snow, unable to advance further due to a lack of fuel. These tanks, which were supposed to spearhead the offensive, became sitting ducks for Allied forces. The lack of fuel was not just a minor inconvenience, it was the core issue that led to the collapse of the German offensive. German commanders on the ground were well aware of the severity of their situation, but Hitler's refusal to adjust his strategy meant they were forced to continue with the attack, even as it became clear that victory was increasingly unlikely. Meanwhile, the Americans demonstrated a remarkable capacity to adjust and overcome the challenges they faced. When Patton's Third Army broke through to Bastogne, it was not just a victory of tanks over tanks, it was the triumph of a more efficient, well-organized fighting force. The ability to quickly marshal resources, to bring in fresh troops, and to keep critical supply routes open allowed the Americans to keep up the pressure. It was a war of attrition. In the best sense, the Americans wore down the Germans not just through superior firepower, but by outlasting them. The Pershing tank, though not yet widely deployed in the early phases of the battle, proved to be another asset in the American arsenal. The 90mm gun mounted on the Pershing could easily destroy the Tiger II and Panther tanks that the Germans had relied on for their offensive. Though it came too late to change the course of the Battle of the Bulge, its role in later engagements in Europe demonstrated the effectiveness of American tank designs and their ability to evolve in response to the enemy's capabilities. The Pershing, like the Sherman, benefited from the sheer scale of its production, allowing the U.S. Army to adapt to emerging threats and maintain a technological edge. While the Germans struggled with these critical logistical issues, the American forces continued to adapt with remarkable efficiency. Air superiority played a crucial role in breaking the German offensive. The Americans had already secured dominance in the skies, and the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang ensured that the German forces could not freely maneuver or supply their troops. The Luftwaffe, which had once been a serious threat, was now all but ineffective in the face of the Allies' strategic air power. German attempts to launch airstrikes against American positions were quickly neutralized by the Allies' superior aircraft, further exacerbating the Germans' struggle to maintain pressure on the ground. This is where the American logistical superiority truly shone. They had the resources and infrastructure to quickly adapt, keep their lines stocked, and maintain offensive pressure. The Germans, on the other hand, were fighting a battle of desperation. Their tanks were bogged down in snow, their fuel running low, and their commanders were restricted by Hitler's orders, which prevented them from adapting quickly enough to changing battlefield conditions. The Germans' failure to manage their resources effectively was a fatal flaw in their strategy. In the end, their decision to fight a war of attrition, based on heavy firepower, but with limited resources and an inflexible command structure, was unsustainable. They could not keep up with the Americans, whose system of strategic flexibility and rapid supply replenishment ultimately wore the Germans down. The Battle of the Bulge, more than just a tank battle or a clash of infantry, was a test of endurance, logistical capability, and adaptability. The Americans, with their clear organizational advantage and unyielding resolve, proved that it wasn't just about firepower, It was about sustaining the fight longer than the enemy could endure. This key aspect of American war strategy, rooted in flexibility, production power, and effective coordination, would carry them through the rest of the war and eventually lead to the collapse of Nazi Germany. The myth of the invincible Tiger II tank began to crumble in the harsh winter of 1944. Initially, these tanks had been heralded as the epitome of German engineering, heavy, powerful, and nearly impervious to Allied fire. But when they were deployed in the freezing, snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, the reality quickly became apparent. The Tiger II, with its heavy armor and potent 88mm gun, was indeed formidable on open terrain, but in the dense forests, it was a cumbersome beast. The snow and mud bogged down the tracks. The tank's weight made it prone to getting stuck, and the cold wreaked havoc on the engine and mechanical systems. Even the vaunted firepower of the Tiger II, which had once made it a feared adversary, was rendered ineffective when its crew struggled to maneuver and fight effectively in such a hostile environment. For the German soldiers who had believed in the Tiger II's invincibility, the reality was sobering. As they trudged through the snow, they watched as the tanks, once thought to be the deciding factor in the war, were immobilized by their own weight. The logistical issues became painfully clear. The fuel ran low, the tanks broke down, and the advancing German forces found themselves unable to keep up the pressure on the Allies. The idea of the Tiger II as a weapon that could turn the tide of the war was shattered. The very tank that was supposed to carry the Germans to victory was now an unreliable, overworked machine that could not sustain its initial success. At the same time, the U-boat fleet, which had once been the terror of the Atlantic, was facing its own collapse of myth. Throughout the early years of the war, U-boats had been a critical part of Germany's strategy, wreaking havoc on Allied shipping lines and inflicting serious damage to the supply chains that kept Britain and the U.S. in the fight. But by the time the Ardennes offensive began, the tide had shifted. The Allies had made significant advancements in anti-submarine warfare technology, particularly with the development of sonar and depth charges. U-boats, once nearly invisible and invulnerable beneath the waves, were now easy targets for Allied warships and aircraft. The Hedgehog, a type of anti-submarine mortar, further compounded the problem, allowing Allied ships to launch devastating attacks on submerged U-boats. The myth of the U-boat's invincibility, like that of the Tiger II, was increasingly undermined as more and more German submarines were sunk before they could carry out their missions. The Luftwaffe, too, was beginning to feel the sting of its once glorious reputation fading. By December 1944, the Mustang and Thunderbolt had achieved air superiority over the skies of Western Europe. The P-51 Mustang, in particular, had evolved into one of the most effective long-range fighters of the war, able to escort Allied bombers all the way to Germany and back. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, was stretched thin. Allied bombings had decimated much of Germany's infrastructure, leaving the Luftwaffe with insufficient aircraft and pilots to maintain effective resistance. The relentless air assaults from the Americans were overwhelming, and German pilots found themselves outnumbered and outmatched. The myth of the Luftwaffe as a dominant force in the skies was swiftly fading as the Americans gained control of the air. The realization among the German commanders was stark. The weapons and tactics that had once been the backbone of their success were now liabilities. Guderian and von Rundstedt, key commanders in the German army, saw the shift in the battlefield dynamics. Their once vaunted tanks, submarines, and aircraft were no longer the decisive advantage they had been. Despite Hitler's orders to press on, they were increasingly aware that the war in the West was lost. The logistical collapse, the mechanical failures, and the overwhelming force of the Allies were too much to overcome. The myth that these weapons could turn the tide was shattered, and the reality was that the Germans were fighting a losing battle. On the Allied side, the American soldiers were aware of the shift in momentum. In Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division held their ground despite being surrounded. They did not celebrate their survival, but instead focused on the task at hand, holding the line until reinforcements arrived. For the Americans, the myth was not about a single weapon or piece of technology, but rather the idea that they could be overwhelmed. They had proven time and time again that they could adapt, that they could hold their ground, and that they could use their industrial and technological edge to overwhelm their enemies. The American logistical superiority had proven to be decisive in the Ardennes. The ability to rapidly replace lost equipment, supply troops with the ammunition and food they needed, and provide reinforcements, quickly allowed the Allies to maintain the pressure. Even as the Germans launched their final desperate offensive, the Americans were able to regroup, reinforce, and push back. The Germans, on the other hand, could not sustain their initial success. As their tanks broke down, their fuel ran out, and their morale faltered, it became increasingly clear that the myth of the invincible German war machine was crumbling. The once feared forces of Nazi Germany were being slowly, methodically, worn down by an opponent who was willing to adapt, endure, and wait for the inevitable collapse of their enemy. By the end of the Ardennes offensive, the myths that had sustained the German war effort were in tatters. The Tiger II, the U-boat, and the Luftwaffe symbols of German strength had all proven to be vulnerable in the face of American ingenuity, adaptation, and persistence. The myth of the invincible Nazi war machine had collapsed under the weight of its own logistical shortcomings and the relentless pressure of the Allies. The war was far from over, but the outcome in the West had been sealed. The collapse of these myths marked the beginning of the end for Germany in World War II. The aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge marked a decisive turning point in the war. For the Allies, the victory at Bastogne and the breaking of the German offensive offered a much-needed boost in morale. The resilience displayed by the 101st Airborne Division and the swift response of General Patton's Third Army were testaments to the strength of the Allied forces and their ability to withstand the worst that the Germans could throw at them. The battle also solidified the strategic superiority of the Allies. While the Germans faltered due to logistical miscalculations and inflexible leadership, the Americans were able to adapt quickly and decisively, turning the tide in their favor. In the short term, this victory allowed the Allies to regroup and push forward. With the Germans exhausted, their resources stretched thin, and their morale shattered, the Western Front became increasingly difficult for them to maintain. The myth of the invincible German war machine had been shattered, and as the Allies advanced into Germany, the final stages of the war were set into motion. But even in the wake of this victory, questions lingered about what might have been. Could the Germans have held on longer if they had adapted their strategy earlier? Would the outcome have been different if Hitler had allowed his commanders more autonomy in making critical battlefield decisions? For the Germans, the loss at Ardennes was the beginning of the end. The inability to sustain their offensive and the breakdown of their logistical network revealed the cracks in their war effort. As their forces withdrew, it became evident that they could not recover from the damage inflicted during the battle. The once feared Tiger II tanks, the U-boats, and the Luftwaffe symbols of German military might had all proven vulnerable to the superior logistics, strategic foresight, and technological advancements of the Allies. Hitler's decision to launch an attack without regard for the realities on the ground had cost him dearly, and the collapse of the German offensive in the Ardennes would be one of the defining moments of their defeat. Looking ahead, the Allies were now poised for the final push into Germany. The victory at Bastogne and the subsequent collapse of the German forces set the stage for the eventual fall of Berlin. But the war was far from over. In the next chapter, the question remains: could the Allies maintain their momentum, or would the Germans, despite their setbacks, manage to regroup for one last stand? The outcome of the war was still in the balance, and the fight for Germany's heartland was yet to come.